Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about my Week 13 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in order to give ourselves some more context as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into Week 13 and forward. And of course, give ourselves some more insight as to who has the most upside going into this upcoming week. After we talk about matchups, we'll of course transition to our top 36 running back rankings as I'll give you guys my perspective and opinion and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to how I think the running back position is going to stack up when it's all said and done by the end of Week 13. Before we begin today's video, if I've ever helped you in terms of anything fantasy related, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we are trying to make a push for 60,000 subscribers before the end of the season. So if you guys have not yet already, click the subscribe button, join the community. Of course, we're not only making fantasy football content every single day, we're trying to help you secure a 2021 fantasy football championship. So be sure to subscribe. For those of you who have already and continue to support, whether it's down in the comment section, of course, liking, just with your viewership, I cannot thank you guys enough for supporting the channel. Also, if you guys haven't yet already, check out Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description of the video. Again, there's multiple contests you can play every single week that can honestly take your fantasy experience to the next level. Besides just playing in your redraft leagues, your dynasty leagues, you can go and draft any player you want. Play pick'ems matchups, play rivals matchups. There's so much of an experience to expand via Underdog Fantasy, so why not go ahead and check it out? Try this upcoming Thursday's matchup, of course, between the Dallas Cowboys and New Orleans Saints. Draft yourself a team and compete against thousands of others. If you sign up today using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, there's a lot of ways to have fun there, and of course, win yourself some money. Check it out. Use promo code Andrew today. Thank you. All right, let's get into our Week 13 running back conversation, beginning with matchups at the position. As we'll transition the screen, as you can see to the left of me, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. Again, I talk about a half PPR, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full PPR or a standard scoring format. As you can see to the very left of the screen, 2021 running back fantasy points allowed. We can see that the New York Jets are giving up the most points per week to opposing running backs. That has been the case for the last, I would say, 10 weeks consistently, as the New York Jets just really cannot stop opposing running backs. This last week obviously found some success against two terrible running back situations with, of course, Rex Burkhead and David Johnson, but nonetheless, they are certainly still a great matchup going forward, followed by the Seattle Seahawks, who last night on Monday Night Football got completely torched by Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissic, who both had great fantasy nights. Also, the Los Angeles Chargers, Detroit Lions, Las Vegas Raiders. Again, a lot of these teams we've seen not only just this season continue to be on the top of this list, but for the last couple years have not been great in terms of stopping the run. While on the other end of this conversation, we have the New Orleans Saints as the new toughest matchup for the running back position, because in the last 2 weeks, we have seen the number one defenses get blown out. Specifically, the Buffalo Bills were the number one defense in terms of giving up the fewest points to running backs. Jonathan Taylor took care of them. And in this last week, it was the Indianapolis Colts. And then, of course, Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette took care of them. Nonetheless, just wanted to give you some perspective as to what the matchups look like going into this upcoming week. Also, the next column of statistics that we have here is 2021 running back rushing stats allowed. Just giving you some context as to how many points defenses are allowing just purely off rushing statistics, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns this season. This is the average per game fantasy points scored for those respective running backs against those teams. As you can see, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers typically do not give up much on the ground. The New Orleans Saints, Washington Football Team, Kansas City Chiefs. These are teams that typically you want to avoid, but at times when you have a stud running back, you're playing them in the matchup regardless. Just wanted to kind of give you guys some more context as to maybe the matchups you're taking advantage of, perhaps the teams that are giving up the most points. All right, now that we've covered this conversation, we can go ahead and transition, and we'll refer back to these statistics throughout the video and talk about our top 36 running back rankings on the week. Do not forget, as I say at every single video, rankings are subject to change for a reason. As the week progresses, there are multiple injuries and or situations that are going to arise that are going to potentially adjust the standings of these specific players in my eyes, and as we progress throughout the week, it will adjust. If you want to stay up to date to my rankings, of course, you can check out my Patreon down below and sign up there, or you can go ahead, show up Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I live stream every Sunday morning with updated rankings ready for you guys to help you out as much as I possibly can. All right, now that that's all covered, let's go ahead and let's begin with our top 36 running back rankings, beginning with the RB1s and the number one running back on the week. It is Jonathan Taylor once again. Of course, we talked about Jonathan Taylor being the king of fantasy football right now, coming off a 17.7 fantasy point performance against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. they've been one of the best run-stop defenses, but when in fact you can find Jonathan Taylor continuing to find success regardless of the matchup, you know he is the number one running back. This upcoming week, they take on the Houston Texans. It's the 8th easiest matchup at the position. All I really have to tell you is it's Jonathan Taylor. He has a great matchup. Not only that, his career against the Houston Texans, he's found a lot of success. In 2020, his 2 fantasy point totals against that defense, 21 points, 17.5. Earlier this season, took on the Houston Texans, put up 28.3 fantasy points. This is going to be potentially a 30-point game for Jonathan Taylor. We'll see how it transpires this week. Moving on, Joe Mixon's our number 2. Joe Mixon has been unbelievable in fantasy football. I mean, just in the NFL. Joe Mixon is just taking it to the next level. And this is what we anticipated in the last couple years. But unfortunately, Joe Mixon dealt with so many injuries, and the offense just wasn't potent enough to get them to this position. But as of late, Joe Mixon has been literally unstoppable in fantasy football. Besides coming off of a 30-point fantasy week against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense of all teams, in the last 6 weeks, he's averaged 23.15 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. In those 6 games, 5 of those performances are 23-plus fantasy points. He scored 4 consecutive weeks of 2 touchdowns. I mean, what more could we ask of Joe Mixon? Taking on the Los Angeles Chargers defense, they are giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs, and all season long have really struggled in terms of stopping the run. I think Joe Mixon in this offense obviously knows that their running game is their advantage, and they're going to continue to flex that on defenses. This week will be no different. Moving on. Austin Ekeler, speaking of the Los Angeles Chargers versus Cincinnati Bengals matchup, is our number 3. He's taken on the Cincinnati Bengals. They give up a fair amount of points to opposing running backs, the 11th most in the National Football League. And the reason why, of course, we have Austin Ekeler in this conversation is because of regardless of how much success he finds on the ground, through the air is obviously going to be his baseline of value. And that's where he continues to succeed and find a lot of value. I mean, 18.9 fantasy points this last week in a game in which they were completely out of the game script, obviously trying to claw back into the contest. I mean, it definitely wasn't a great overall experience for that Los Angeles Chargers offense. Nonetheless, Austin Ekeler found success. With only 12 carries, 31 yards, the receiving work is always going to be the game script proof, kind of factor that Austin Ekeler always presents. Nonetheless, going into this upcoming week, it is an easier matchup. Austin Ekeler this season is averaging 19.74 fantasy points per game. So, of course, he's maintaining in our lineups, and regardless of last week's performance, is going to be that much better this week because Justin Herbert has been inconsistent, but he's like one off, one on, one off, one on. And if Justin Herbert gets to that next level and makes this a little bit more of a competitive matchup, he'll be fantastic with Austin Ekeler. Moving on, Alexander Mattison is our number 4. Now, I talked about Alexander Mattison during our waiver wire episode yesterday in relation to what exactly we're going to see from Dalvin Cook. From the information that's pretty much been passed down, Dalvin Cook's probably going to miss just about 2 to 3 weeks. 3 weeks is probably worst case scenario. 2 weeks is most likely. So where does that leave us with Alexander Mattison this week? If in fact you have him rostered, well, of course, he is an automatic play, taking on the Detroit Lions. I mean, the last time he took on the Detroit Lions was earlier this year, in fact. He put up 22.8 fantasy points in which he had 113 rushing yards, 7 targets, 7 catches, 40 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. All of those kind of statistics piling up for a player like Alexander Mattison, once again taking on a defense that is giving up the 4th most points to running backs. It's a walk in the park, really. That's what it is. I mean, not only did he find success this last season against Detroit, but I mean, earlier this year, he had himself a matchup in which he scored 20.1 fantasy points against the Seattle Seahawks. The year prior in 2020, in week 17 against the Detroit Lions, Dalvin Cook did not play, and Alexander Mattison went for 28 total fantasy points. There's a lot of potential to be had here. And regardless of who's in the backfield for the Minnesota Vikings, success is going to be had because in the last 2 weeks, Dalvin Cook's been averaging about 20 fantasy points per game. And if Alexander Mattison was in his stead for the last 2 weeks, in my opinion, honestly, I believe Alexander Mattison would have had very similar statistics. They're very similar running backs, and they're going to be given an exposure of opportunity that cannot be denied. He's our number 4 this week. Moving on to Elijah Mitchell, our thumbnail for today's video. Elijah Mitchell, I mean, he is just taking over the league slowly as this 49ers offense is beginning to impose their will on every single defense they see. I mean, in the last couple weeks, they have been running the ball hyper efficiently. And with Elijah Mitchell healthy and in the lineup, he's been getting the ball 27 plus times per game in the last 2 games that he has played on the ground alone. That kind of opportunity is unreal, considering on top of the fact, this last week had 6 targets that led to 5 receptions. When you're getting that kind of touches, I mean, nobody could really stop you. They take on the Seattle Seahawks, of course, the second easiest matchup at the running back position. Let's not forget Deebo Samuel. In the last 2 weeks, has only had 2 receptions in this offense. On top of that, he's going to be missing some future time. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention that he's going to be missing time, and he's only caught the ball twice in the last 2 weeks, is because he was still putting up 15 fantasy points per game in the last 2 games that he participated in. And why is that? Well, he's been running the ball a lot. He's been pretty much serving as a running back in his backfield with 19 carries for 181 total yards and 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. That's 42.1 fantasy points just off of rushing stats. If those touches are going to, of course, be given in the direction of Elijah Mitchell, then of course, the fantasy point upside is an unbelievable one that may be uncapped this week in a great matchup. Moving on, Leonard Fournette. Dude, playoff Lenny has kind of just, it's activated already. And it's pretty early for it to be activated, but nonetheless, when we get down to this, late stretch of games, playoff Lenny is going to be asked to do a lot for this team, and certainly did he do that in a matchup in which they needed him to step up. And to be honest, it was the toughest matchup of the week. Nonetheless, Leonard Fournette came out, scored 4 touchdowns, surpassed 100 rushing yards, averaged over 5 yards per carry, had himself 40.6 half PPR fantasy points. That is absolutely unbelievable. And as he continues, this upcoming week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons, of course, the 7th easiest matchup at the position. It is a defense that really cannot stop anybody and an offense that cannot move the ball properly enough. With Cordarrelle Patterson back, of course, they're going to be efficient in some capacities, but this is going to be a one-sided affair in which the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are scoring in bunches. With that said, if Tampa Bay is scoring in bunches, of course, Leonard Fournette is going to get his and so forth. But there is a little bit of a contingency. There's a little bit of a concern that maybe if, in fact, they get into a point where the game script in the second half is extremely one-sided, Ronald Jones comes in. Ronald Jones has scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks. If he comes in, steals a touchdown, scores in the late half, there's not as much upside for Fournette, but either way, he is getting the start from me. He's looked fantastic, and as long as the touches through the air on the ground continue to go in his direction, he's a great play. Najee Harris is our number 7 for this week. I mean, look, Najee Harris, though he's coming off of his worst performance of the entire season, we have to put it in perspective. Do not allow one performance to discourage you from playing a Najee Harris in this upcoming week's matchup. Yes, 5.2 fantasy points against the Cincinnati Bengals was awful, but let's not forget the score at halftime was 31-3. That was the game was over at halftime. So it didn't matter what the Pittsburgh Steelers pretty much put forth in the second half. And obviously, based on Najee Harris's total touches, 8 carries and 3 receptions, they didn't really care about what was going to transpire in that second half. Nonetheless, they're going to be healthy. They're going to go into this upcoming week against the Baltimore Ravens, a division rival, and they're going to try to run the ball. And they're going to try to impose their will with Najee Harris as their lead back. I mean, from weeks 2 through 11, Najee Harris was averaging 18.14 half PPR fantasy points. So let's not think that he wasn't a great back. He was the number 4 overall running back throughout that span of time and continues to be in this top conversation. He is starting in my lineups, hopefully, as well as yours. Antonio Gibson is our number 8. Had himself a surprising, incredible performance. Though I thought he was going to play well against the Seattle Seahawks, I did not anticipate him to get a total of 36 touches. 29 on the ground, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 35 receiving yards. And let's not forget, this also includes J.D. McKissic stealing 2 touchdowns in last night's game. If those touchdowns go in the direction of Antonio Gibson, he may have himself a 40-point game at the end of the night. Nonetheless, the reason why I want to talk about Antonio Gibson as a top 8 prospect going into this week, first and foremost, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, it is an easy matchup. Second, in the 4 games that he has had 20 or more touches this season already, he has surpassed 20 fantasy points 3 out of the 4 times. That just means that opportunity is going to continue to lead to success for this young man, and that's what I anticipate this upcoming week. Not only that, when you go back to his rookie season, in the 3 games in which he had 20 or more touches, he averaged 20.5 fantasy points. If you get this man 20 touches, he is going to be able to just pretty much dominate the game, dominate time of possession, and continue to run the ball. It finally took this team this long to, of course, realize, man, running the ball is what we're good at. They got Brandon Scherff back. They're ready to go. J.D. McKissic may be in concussion protocol based on the hit he took last night, and there may be a situation where it may be only Antonio Gibson out of this backfield. The amount of targets he got last night, could be fantastic this upcoming week. Moving on. Alvin Kamara is our number 9. As of what I have read or heard as of this week, he has practiced 3 consecutive days in a row. He's dealing with an MCL injury. He's obviously been off for 3 weeks, and hopefully he's going to come back and find success. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys on Thursday, depending on what capacity we see him, is obviously going to dictate his overall performance, whether he's limited on a snap count or a full capacity. That'll pretty much determine his overall success. But let me just go ahead and read a couple stats here. In terms of what the Dallas Cowboys have given up to opposing running backs as of late. Josh Jacobs, 18.2 points. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 14.6. we had Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams. Melvin Gordon 16.5 and Javonte Williams 11.1. In that game, had a touchdown call back for Javonte Williams. He could have had himself over 16 fantasy points. We had Rhamondre Stevenson and Damien Harris. Damien Harris was 17.3 points, while Rhamondre had 13.7 points. I mean, that's 30 fantasy points between two running backs in that matchup. Running backs have succeeded against this defense as of late. If Alvin Kamara is ready to go at a full capacity, I think he'll be fantastic and will be in my lineup for Thursday. Moving on, we have James Conner as our number 10, taking on the Chicago Bears. Middle of the road matchup, but again, let's not forget Khalil Mack is out, but so is their middle linebacker, Danny Trevathan, and one of their interior defensive linemen was out this last week. Even though that was the case, DeAndre Swift got injured. Jamaal Williams was able to make the most of it, get over 10 fantasy points. Nonetheless, taking on the Chicago Bears, James Conner is in a very advantageous position. Chase Edmonds, probably not returning from IR this week, will most likely return in week 14. So with that said, we'll get Kyler back in the lineup, we'll get DeAndre Hopkins back in the lineup, and of course, running the ball is going to continue to be a consistent part of this offense, and hopefully going to be the case even when Chase Edmonds returns, considering how successful James Conner has been. The stat that I wanted to read, from weeks 3 through 11 of the 2021 season, James Conner has been the number 3 overall running back in terms of fantasy points and fantasy points per game. The guy's averaging 16.87 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. That amount of success obviously can be attributed to his 13 touchdowns in the last 9 games. But let's just be honest. He's been playing far better than he has in his entire career. He's looked fantastic. He's staying healthy, and he's in a very potent offense, regardless of who's under center. That is something that cannot be undersold. James Conner, regardless of matchup, firing him up. He's going to be great as a number 10 this week. Number 11, we have Cordarrelle Patterson. Again, Cordarrelle Patterson coming off a 26.5 fantasy point performance, 108 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, made it look easy out there. I mean, it's just unbelievable how great these wide receiver converted running backs are playing. Deebo Samuel, Cordarrelle Patterson, they're just running all over defenses. Nonetheless, he takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. We know it's a difficult matchup. It's a fact. And probably Cordarrelle Patterson's not going to find as much success this upcoming week against Tampa Bay as he did against the Jacksonville Jaguars this last week. But I have a feeling that he's going to still be a potent enough fantasy prospect that he's a must start this upcoming week. Mainly because when we go back to week 2 of the 2021 fantasy football season, of course, they took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And that was the game in which Cordarrelle Patterson pretty much had his breakout game. With a stat line of 7 carries for 11 yards and 1 rushing touchdown, that obviously wasn't the greatest, but his receiving work is where he began to break out. 7 targets, 5 receptions, 58 yards, and a receiving touchdowns, all for 21.4 fantasy points. This season already, outside of week 1 and the injury week that he sustained, he has pretty much been 13 plus fantasy points in every single game of the season. That is pretty much all we can ask for. Consistency's been there, opportunity's been there, and it's going to continue this upcoming week against Tampa Bay. Moving on, number 12 is Darrell Henderson. Now, earlier yesterday, there was a report that obviously Sean McVay had been quoted to say that Darrell Henderson sustained a quad strain during that game against the Green Bay Packers on Sunday. What exactly does that mean? I don't even know. Okay, I'm sure there's a fantasy doctor out there that will certainly explain it to us. But the conversation that I'm hearing is that there's a potential that he could play because he played throughout the entire game. We're going to have to keep an eye on it because it can be a minor, could be a major one, and it will maybe be a situation where you need to have Sony Michel on roster if you have Darrell Henderson. So if in fact there's a potential that he plays, I don't want to prioritize Sony Michel for those of you that you don't manage already Darrell Henderson. So kind of keep it in an idea that if I was going to go after him on my overall running back list from yesterday, he would probably be ahead of Breida, but probably behind Boston Scott. So the number 5 spot going into this week until we get further information. So with that said, we're going to have to keep an eye on what exactly is going on. I mean, to be honest, if in fact Darrell Henderson can't even go, you could probably get some wide receivers to run the ball against Jacksonville because it is one of the easiest matchups. In the last 2 weeks, Deebo Samuel went for 8 carries, 79 yards, and a touchdown, while Cordarrelle Patterson went for 16 carries, 108, and 2 touchdowns. If these wide receivers are running the ball this successfully, if we have Darrell Henderson fully healthy and ready to go, I mean, he's coming off a 15-point fantasy performance. He'll be an absolute must-start play against Jacksonville's defense. It should be a one-sided affair. So we'll talk about Sony Michel in a little bit in terms of where I have him ranked. But for right now, if Darrell Henderson's playing, he's in my lineup. Let's move on to the RB2 conversation, beginning with Ezekiel Elliott. He takes on the New Orleans Saints. It is one of the toughest matchups. In his career, he has not found much success, but he has been a full participant despite all that we heard in the last couple of days about him potentially being shut down for the next couple of weeks. With Zeke pretty much kind of rolling through this injury, playing tough. I understand that could potentially slow him down later on in the season, but for right now, if he is healthy and ready to go, I mean, not quote unquote healthy, but at least starting, then he's going to be in my lineup because there's a bunch of opportunities that not only is he going to get opportunity through the receiving game. I mean, he had 8 targets, 6 receptions this last week. He's had 12 receptions combined in the last 2 games. In a full PPR scoring format, this man is going to get over 10 fantasy points. And if he falls into the end zone, he's even that much better. I think, yes, it is a very difficult matchup, but I'm going to trust that this offense is potent enough to move the ball, get down to the end zone, and give their running back the opportunity he needs. Obviously, like we saw last week, Tony Pollard wasn't given goal line opportunities. It was all Zeke all the time. And the only way Tony Pollard was able to score, a 100-yard kick return. Nonetheless, if Zeke's active, he's in my lineup. Moving on, we have James Robinson at number 14. James Robinson has been a great overall running back since week 3. He's been the number 11 overall running back in fantasy in terms of total fantasy points at the running back position and fantasy points per game scored. As long as he is in a situation where this game can be closer, or at least he's getting opportunity in the receiving game, 3 receptions this last week for 29 yards, that will kind of mellow out his baseline, but it's a matter of him finding the end zone. Because not every week he's going to be able to compile over 80 rushing yards, especially in a game in which he has to take on the Los Angeles Rams. Now, in my opinion, the Rams defense can't do anything right at this moment, so there's a very good chance that the Jacksonville Jaguars are able to successfully run the ball. And if James Robinson does find the end zone, he's very easily 15 fantasy points. But that is the one contingency. Can he fall into the end zone? Can he find the end zone? And is this offense good enough with Trevor Lawrence to move the ball effectively, get down into that position, and help him score? That is always going to be the dilemma that we have with Jacksonville Jaguars running backs going forward for the rest of this season. And either way, I think I trust James Robinson enough to get the job done, and that's why we have him at 14. Number 15 is Josh Jacobs. I mean, Josh Jacobs takes on the Washington football team, middle of the pack, kind of competition there at the running back position. But I mean, Josh Jacobs coming off of a week in which he had a total of 24 touches. I mean, the 3 weeks prior was able to pretty much barely get to that number. If he's continuing to get this kind of ample opportunity, obviously the Las Vegas Raiders were up in that game. And that's the biggest difference maker. Because the week prior against the Cincinnati Bengals, they got blown out. And Josh Jacobs couldn't be utilized because they had to throw the ball for the majority of that second half. So if they're in a game script against Washington, in which it's a lower scoring one, and Josh Jacobs continues to stay a part of this scheme and continues to stay a part of the game script and ahead of it, I think running the ball is going to be, obviously, like we've seen for the last couple of years, the main priority of this offense. Run the ball, then go ahead and allow Derek Carr to take advantage of play action, etc., third downs, and short. Josh Jacobs is a huge part of this offense, and as long as he's succeeding, we'll be fine. I mean, it just took finding the end zone for him to really get to this fantasy relevancy, because earlier this season, he had 3 consecutive games in which he scored touchdowns, and he was 14-plus points in every single game. If he can get back to that kind of standard, he'll be fantastic. Moving on. David Montgomery is our number 16 overall running back. It is mind-blowing to imagine that the Bears could not run the ball on the Detroit Lions. I mean, it is literally one of the easiest matchups at the position. Teams every single week find so much success against that Detroit Lions front 7 and are able to consistently run the ball. But, of course, Matt Nagy, that offense, they somehow flounder that opportunity, aren't able to find success there, and barely win that game against the Detroit Lions. With that all said, David Montgomery is the main key of this offense. If they want to continue to succeed and or win games, they have to continue to utilize him. 17 carries on the ground, 3 receptions, 20 total touches. Eventually, that will lead to a breakout run, to a touchdown, and get you the fantasy points that we're all looking for. 8.9 fantasy points, I can assure you, isn't his upside. That is his baseline floor, and we're only going up from here on forth, even against the Arizona matchup this upcoming week. Moving on to Myles Gaskin. Myles Gaskin has been incredible. 17-plus fantasy points each of the last 2 weeks, coming off of another game in which he was given great opportunity, 18 total touches, 2 touchdowns for him. I mean, that is just basically what we've been asking for all season long. Give Myles Gaskin the ball. Pretty much pick up where we left off last season, where the guy was averaging about 18 touches per game at the back end of the 2020 season. I mean, in the last 4 weeks alone, Myles Gaskin's averaging 21.25 touches per game, 13.25 half PPR fantasy points, and has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. That's pretty much all you can ask for. And that's pretty much all we need. They take on the New York Giants this upcoming week. I know Phillip Lindsay got himself heavily involved, but that was mainly as garbage time. I think Myles Gaskin, of course, is going to continue to maintain as the number 1 back of this offense, and we'll see that this week once again against the Giants. Moving on to Miles Sanders. I know he's dealing with a bit of an injury, and from what I heard from Nick Sirianni, he's dealing with a little bit of soreness. But you know who else is dealing with a little bit of soreness? It is Jalen Hurts. If we get a situation in which Miles Sanders is playing inactive and is going to be the starter in this offense, and he obviously gets a full participation in practice by at least Friday, I'm confident enough starting him at this position against the New York Jets, who are giving up 31 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in fantasy this season. Miles Sanders, in my opinion, would have an incredible performance. Again, there have been 18 different running backs this season that have put up 10 plus points against this New York Jets defense. And as long as Jalen Hurts may be a little bit, hurt and may not be as active to run the ball, there's a situation where this offense that is running the ball more than just about anybody in the National Football League over the last month of the season is going to hand it off to Miles Sanders 15 plus times, maybe even 20 times if they continue to find success. And that is what I'm hoping for this upcoming week. Saquon Barkley is our number 19. Man, Saquon Barkley is a puzzle. I don't know how to solve the puzzle, and I don't know when it's going to potentially be solved, considering Daniel Jones is dealing with an injury. That entire wide receiver core is completely just injured at all times. I mean, literally, Sterling Shepard, and then it's Tony, and then it's Golladay, and it's just a complete rotation of guys getting injured. With that all being said, he's a talented enough running back that despite taking on the Miami Dolphins, who have pretty much practically given up nothing on the ground as of late, I still think that Saquon Barkley can have one run, can have one play that defines a game, and then gets him back on track. I really do think that the talent will continue to shine through despite how bad the New York Giants offensive line, offensive coordinating, and just offensive personnel is that surrounds him. It just takes a couple plays to get him back on track. Moving on, we have Javonte Williams as our number 20, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. But I don't want to just talk about Javonte Williams. I want to talk about both Denver Broncos running backs because they deserve to be talked about in the same manner, because truly, it's a coin toss as to who is going to be the better overall running back. Am I starting both? Yes. I'm starting both. Even if I'm in the same lineup, if these are my two best running backs going into the week, I'll start them both. It does not matter to me. I think they can both very easily come off of a week in which they both have 15 fantasy points. They're both given incredible opportunity. Javonte Williams, 14 carries, 54 yards, a touchdown, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 57 yards, 18.6 fantasy points. If that touchdown goes in the direction of a Melvin Gordon, who had 17 carries for 83 yards, 1 catch for 5, and 9.3 fantasy points, you pretty much have a completely switched scenario. And we've seen that all season long, where Javonte has as many yards, has as many touches, but doesn't get the goal line touchdown. But now it's kind of been reversed. And hopefully, what I was anticipating earlier in the season was that they would go after the bye week and give Javonte Williams the lead going forward and give him the goal line carries and give him the opportunity, because they know he is the running back of the future. And they know Melvin Gordon is not on this team next season, as his contract will expire. I think both of them are great players. I'm hoping they both go off against Kansas City. That's the only way to beat Kansas City. Run the ball, keep it away from Patrick Mahomes, and continue to pound the rock. Moving on, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Speaking of the Kansas City Chiefs, coming off of a bye week here. I mean, look, Clyde Edwards is a great running back. When he's healthy, he's good to go. But my only concern about this situation is his opportunity. If Darrell Williams is going to start peeping his head out and having more touches than we saw last time this team, obviously played, then we may have an issue in that regard. But if that's not going to be the case, the only thing that worries me about Clyde Edwards is that he's probably not going to catch the ball much. The last time we saw him, only 2 targets, 2 catches, was able to get himself a rushing touchdown. I'm not worried about that. He will get those kind of opportunities. He will be given that, and we've already seen that earlier this season prior to his injury against the Los Angeles Chargers and, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles, in which he found a lot of success against them on the ground. I think Kansas City's offense, of course, needs to be more dynamic. They cannot be a pass-only offense. They have to run the ball. They have to set tempo in that regard. They have to chew clock. Clyde Edwards will be leading the charge in that regard. Moving on, Damien Harris. Now, listen, they take on the Buffalo Bills. It is a very tough matchup. Like I mentioned, there was a possibility that the Buffalo Bills were very upset about that Jonathan Taylor incident, and they were going to take it out on the New Orleans Saints, and they absolutely did. They did, outright. Now, the question regarding Damien Harris is whether or not this Patriots offense is going to be potent enough against one of these top-tier defenses to run the ball consistently. I mean, this last week, they took on a top-tier defense against the Tennessee Titans, and of course, Damien Harris was able to get 11.7 fantasy points, but this was purely off of just getting in the end zone. If Damien Harris does not find the end zone in that game, well, of course, he's not as good of a fantasy prospect, and we're in a lot of trouble, perhaps being a little bit more concerned this week, considering, of course, Damien Harris had a little bit of a lesser yard per carry average than Rhamondre Stevenson, who is breathing down his neck every single week. Nonetheless, he is the main goal line back if they're ever in that scenario, of course he's going to be called upon. Like we saw Jonathan Taylor do, the Buffalo Bills are not immune to giving up points on the ground. Hopefully Damien Harris will be able to take advantage of anything that is thrown in his direction. Moving on, Jamaal Williams is our number 24, another one of these waiver wire pickups. With DeAndre Swift most likely missing this week, I think Jamaal Williams is a top 24 running back against the Minnesota Vikings based on touches primarily, in my opinion. I mean, when we look at what DeAndre Swift has been given in the last couple weeks, I mean, of course, the carries have been there. I mean, what was it? Against Pittsburgh, he had 33 carries a couple weeks back. When Jamaal Williams came into this game early on, we didn't really anticipate him to be given 20 total touches, but he did nonetheless. And if he's going to be given that kind of opportunity this season already, in the games that Jamaal Williams has had 14 or more touches, he's averaged 11.92 half PPR fantasy points. If that kind of opportunity is going to be in that scenario, then why not? Because the Detroit Lions have mainly found their success from running the ball. And Jamaal Williams was the hammer for this offense for, majority of the early season prior to his injury. I think there's a very good chance here, on top of the fact that the Minnesota Vikings have given up 5 touchdowns to opposing running backs in the last 4 games alone. There's a great opportunity for Jamaal Williams to succeed as an RB2 this week. Moving on to the RB3 conversation, let's begin with Boston Scott. Again, if Miles Sanders is going to be hobbled and injured and not going to play as much, then Boston Scott will move up into his position later this week. Of course, because they play against the Jets. They've given up 18 performances of 10-plus fantasy points to opposing running backs. They give up 31 fantasy points per game to running backs. Jalen Hurts is hobbled and dealing with an injury. If those two guys are going to be dealing with situations of an injury, well, Boston Scott's performance this last week pretty much kind of gives us an indication as to what will happen. Boston Scott, 15 carries, 64 yards, and a touchdown, 12.2 fantasy points with 2 catches for 8 yards. If, in fact, we will continue to see Boston Scott be used in this capacity because of Miles Sanders being injured, Jalen Hurts being a little bit banged up, Kenneth Gainwell primarily only being a receiving back, Jordan Howard still dealing with an injury, then Boston Scott could be very, very good this week and maybe even better than number 25 overall. Here we go. Number 26 is Devonta Freeman. Devonta Freeman, I mean, look, if you're going to be the starting running back of the Baltimore Ravens, you're going to have opportunity. 16 carries this last week. Maybe if he gets some goal line exposure, it's a different conversation. But this team, I mean, when Lamar Jackson's throwing 4 interceptions, when they're not able to move the ball as effectively as they normally will, of course, Lamar Jackson coming back from his illness, I mean, if that's pretty much the difference maker, if he needs another week under his belt to kind of get healthy and back to himself, then obviously this offense is going to be able to move the ball. The thing that I wanted to mention is that though we may typically be afraid of playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers or specifically playing running backs against them, I don't think I'm afraid anymore. They're giving up the 10th most points in the league to running backs. In the last 3 weeks, I know, Devonta Freeman isn't Joe Mixon, Ekeler, and Swift, but Swift went for 130 on them. Ekeler went for 115 all-purpose yards and 4 touchdowns. Joe Mixon went for 165 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Running backs have found an incredible amount of success against this defense. Why not Devonta Freeman? Moving on to Tony Pollard, our number 27. If Zeke is going to be limited in any capacity, which I honestly think he may not be limited, but he's going to certainly split carries with Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard has looked good, and though this last week was only averaging about 3.6 yards per carry, he is a playmaker, and he will find himself scoring. I mean, last week, he had himself a touchdown called back. The week prior, had himself step out on the 1-yard line. Could have had a touchdown in that game as well. Touchdowns have been the ever-elusive variable in Tony Pollard's overall stat line, and obviously getting himself a 100-yard kick return is going to get him over 10 fantasy points, and that's great, 14.8 this last week. But if he's not able to get that touchdown, playing against New Orleans, he may be limited in the receiving game if Zeke is going to be exclusively kind of handling that work this upcoming week. I'm hoping it's not going to be the case. I think Pollard, regardless, is a decent play in a matchup in which the Dallas Cowboys and New Orleans Saints should be, in my opinion, a higher scoring event. Moving on to our number 28, we have Matt Breida. Listen, from the onset, I mean, Matt Breida was the starting running back against that New Orleans Saints team last Thursday on Thanksgiving. And as long as he's going to come out and continue to be the starter for this team, I don't really care who they play against. The New England Patriots, not a problem. I mean, they just gave up 2 100-yard rushers last week. Of course, Zach Moss was a healthy scratch if he's not going to be active, and Singletary is going to be the garbage time running back and kind of every now and then play. Matt Breida getting work in the receiving game, getting work on the ground, being hyper efficient with his opportunities, we'll take it. That's all we can potentially ask for. And I think going into this upcoming week's matchup, this is the reason why I wanted to mention him in the waiver wire episode, because you should be going out and acquiring him if you're in need of a running back. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson, our number 29. Again, Rhamondre Stevenson has talent. He has the ability. He's already passed the eye test per se, right? If he's given full opportunity, he could probably be better than Damien Harris, but that's not the conversation for this week. It's a matter of whether or not he could score against Buffalo. I think this could be a scenario in which the New England Patriots find a weakness in this Buffalo defense, and it's going to be extremely tough for Mac Jones to pass the ball, and they rely on their running game. There is a very good chance that both these guys could find success, specifically Damien Harris and Rhamondre Stevenson. All they have to do is continue to pound the rock and kill clock and keep the ball away from Josh Allen in order to find success in this scenario, and I think that's what the game plan is going to potentially revolve around this week. Moving on, Ronald Jones is our number 30. Listen, I love Ronald Jones as long as he is not killing the value of Leonard Fournette. If he's going to start taking value away from Fournette, we may be in a little bit of a trickier situation in which it may look like Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon, where both guys are getting great touches, but touchdowns are defining the week. In the last 2 weeks of the season, of course, he has scored a touchdown. One in which it was a blowout contest this last week, in which the Buccaneers running game could not be stopped. Even with Ali Marpet, their starting left guard out, they really could not be stopped. They take on the Atlanta Falcons this weekend. What we know about the Atlanta Falcons, they're giving up the 7th most points to running backs. If there's a scenario in which, of course, Ronald Jones, this offense, they're going to be blowing out that defense, why not run him in the second half, get a lot of yardage, and maybe a rushing touchdown. Garbage time could be a helper for Ronald Jones' overall baseline of value. Moving on, we have Alex Collins at 31. I don't trust Alex Collins, but he's the starting running back of a football team. And if he's going to be given an opportunity, then by all means, maybe they're going to decide to fix the things that they completely suck at, which is running the ball, pass blocking, passing, special teams, defense. This team is just terrible. Why do I have Alex Collins here? Purely out of respect for being a starting running back in the National Football League. Does that constitute to anything? No. This probably changes by the end of today's episode. Honestly, Alex Collins could be at number 36, and I'm pretty happy. But honestly, he could fall into the end zone at any given moment and have 10 plus points. It's very possible. We've seen him do it this season already. So hopefully they'll get back on track, but if not, play with caution. Moving on, we have Tevin Coleman, another person we should be cautious about. With the fact that Zach Wilson does not know how to throw the ball to his respective running backs, especially at the capacity in which Mike White and Joe Flacco were doing it. I think Tevin Coleman pretty much is the guy going forward until Michael Carter returns. Obviously, Tevin Coleman got a rushing touchdown pretty much siphoned from him. Ty Johnson was a non-factor, even though he was pretty efficient in terms of running the ball. I think it was like 6 carries for 42 yards. All in all, Tevin Coleman's the guy if you were in need of a running back. They have to play against, I guess an easier matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. Is it the easiest? No. But I think the Jets, it's just sketchy. Playing as Jet when Zach Wilson is under center is pretty much a death wish, and I don't really want that for any of you. Moving on. We have 2 running backs that are pretty much backups who are contingent as to whether or not their starter plays. If Sony Michel is going to be the starter and Darrell Henderson is not active, similar with Mark Ingram with Alvin Kamara, then both these guys get a huge upgrade. Otherwise, they sit back here in scenarios in which maybe if in fact they're given opportunities here and there, they could, kind of expand upon their overall performances. But outside of that, they sit here, they're handcuffs, and they may get a couple touches, may score a lucky touchdown. That's pretty much the extent of their, kind of baseline floor. Upside would be only if they're starting and getting the maximum opportunity. The last 2 players I wanted to mention are also a tandem. It is David Johnson and Rex Burkhead. I wanted to mention these 2 players because, again, though they both only put up 6.5 and 6.9 total fantasy points against the Indianapolis Colts, they could have value. They could. One of these guys could, get some work in the receiving game, could find value in that regard. Of course, it wasn't just a couple weeks back in which, somehow the Houston Texans were able to beat the Tennessee Titans and then turn around and lose to the Jets. I know the Jets beat the Titans earlier this year, but NFL math just doesn't make sense. Nonetheless, these are the only other 2 guys that may have value. I know J.D. McKissic is dealing with a little bit of a concussion/neck injury. I don't know if he's going to be playing this week. If he is, Las Vegas could keep him in a top 36 relevancy. Outside of that, maybe Ty Johnson if Zach Wilson knows how to throw to his respective running backs. I doubt that happens within 1 week's time. Either way, these are our top 36 running back rankings for week 13 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy in the link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew today. And of course, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. I cannot thank you guys enough for supporting. Tomorrow, we'll talk about our top 36 wide receivers, matchups, and all of that business. Until next time, I appreciate you guys. Have a good one, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.